something that's, kind of bitchy.
Pretty bitchy.
Bitchy?
I know. It was just, bitchy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
Welcome to Bitchy History, where we cut through the myths and nostalgia to get to the raw, unvarnished truth about the past. With sharp analysis, a feminist lens, and just the right amount of bitchiness, we're here to show you that history isn't just something to study, it's something to question. Let's get started. Welcome back to Bitchy History. Before we get started today, I need to start this episode with a little bit of a disclaimer. I'll address it again later in the episode as well. The medical system is a nightmare for women and people of color. Doctors are routinely trained to see whiny women and drug-seeking behavior from those of us just trying to get a diagnosis for chronic pain, cysts on our ovaries, and dozens of other issues that impact us. Does that mean that we don't trust science? No. I was vaccinated as an infant, I get my flu shot every year, and my COVID booster when I can convince the pharmacist to let me have it. I grew up without health insurance. So any lingering reluctance to go to the doctor for issues is related to that habit, not because I think I can cure anything that's wrong with me with organic food and crystals. Doctors do save lives, but their training sometimes leads them to disregard their patients' autonomy and knowledge about their own body. Does that mean I think you should give birth in a field and never take a single tablet of folic acid while pregnant? Absolutely the fuck not. So while this episode is a scathing criticism of the patriarchal formation of the professional medical field, which was built on the literal ashes of medieval midwives and herb women, it's also not advocacy for an anti-vax, woo-woo, free birtherism mindset. Get prenatal care. Go to trained midwives and doctors for your pregnancy, but also know how to advocate for yourself. Now, let's move on to the pyres. Let's be honest. Whenever someone says witch hunts, most people picture medieval peasants, a bonfire, a pointy hat, and maybe a live-action reenactment of the Monty Python and the Holy Grail scene.
We have found the witch, may we burn her?
How do you know she is a witch? She looks like one.
That's cute, but it's also wrong. The witch hunts didn't actually belong to the so-called Dark Ages. They weren't the product of medieval ignorance or backward superstition. They were, in fact, a feature of the very era that also produced the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and whole cities full of dudes arguing about astronomy while wearing tights. According to historians like Ronald Hutton in The Witch, A History of Fear, the real witch-hunting frenzy happened between the years of 1450 and 1750, smack in the middle of Europe's celebrated intellectual awakening. Essentially, the same society that gave us Shakespeare also gave us, let's burn that woman over there for looking a little weird. And you wonder why feminists have trust issues. Of the roughly 40,000 people executed for witchcraft in Europe, 75 to 85% of them were women, a statistic so tilted that it might need to visit a chiropractor. As Owen Davies emphasizes in the Oxford History of Witchcraft and Magic, witchcraft accusations weren't random bolts of cultural lightning. They were part of a highly gendered system of fear. Witches became shorthand for anxious masculinity. Women who refused to obey, women who lived alone, women who owned property, women who knew things, women who weren't sufficiently deferential. In other words, women who did absolutely anything except smile politely and die quietly. But witch hunts weren't merely about misogyny in the abstract, they were about power, who got to heal, who got to speak, and who got to control women's bodies. When a society is terrified of the people who deliver babies, something deeper is going on. Before we get to the midwives who were caught in this gendered crossfire, let's sit for a moment with the long-term consequences. Because here's the thesis of this entire episode. Every time a government, a church, or a medical establishment has panicked about women having too much authority, the results have been catastrophic. Ask any woman who's ever tried to get a doctor to take her pain seriously. If you're listening and thinking, wow, this sounds familiar, congratulations, you've cracked the code. The witch hunts were the original moral panic about uppity women, and the blueprint they created still shapes everything from obstetric violence to anti-abortion laws. So how did we get from community healers to courtroom trials? Why midwives? Why now? And why were women who literally kept everyone alive through childbirth suddenly the villains of the story? To answer that, we need to go back. before the bonfires, before the demon hunting manuals, before the witch hunters wrote the world's first fan fiction about satanic girl bosses. We need to look at the world before fear swallowed women's knowledge whole. Picture Europe before the professionalization of medicine, a world without hospitals as we know them, without anesthesia, without the calming presence of a man in a white coat who charges $600 for a consult. For any Brits or Europeans listening, that's American healthcare without insurance. I am not exaggerating. Healing wasn't a profession, it was a practice woven into daily life, community rituals, and women's expertise. The line between healer, midwife, herbalist, and neighbor with common sense was blurry and in most places completely unpoliced. Women were the frontline workers of the medieval and early modern world. They treated fevers, dressed wounds, mixed remedies, whispered prayers, and most importantly, brought babies into the world. As Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English note in their book Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, women's medical authority existed not because it was permitted by institutions, but because it was necessary. Childbirth was the central medical event of life, and who attended it every single time? Women. Midwives weren't fringe figures. They were essential to communities. They were trusted. They were often the most experienced medical practitioners a community had. They understood herbs, anatomy, labor techniques, and what to do when things went wrong. They were what we would now call experiential experts, and they gained that knowledge the only way possible in a world without medical schools, by doing the work, again and again and again. But here's the twist. The very qualities that made midwives indispensable also made them threatening. Women who had knowledge about the body, especially the reproductive body, held a kind of power that patriarchal institutions couldn't control. As Maxwell Stewart shows in Witch Beliefs and Witch Trials in the Middle Ages, church authorities as early as the 13th century issued warnings about women who heal through herbs and incantations. You can almost hear the subtext. We do not understand female bodies, and therefore anyone who does is suspicious. Not that that's changed much with men in power today.
You recognize for a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. President. And my question is, starts on page 3. On line 9, we have a bullet there where, no pun intended, which states that abortion is okay to remove an ectopic pregnancy. And can you explain to me why that exception is in there?
I don't know. It's crazy. Maybe, just maybe, it's because an ectopic pregnancy is not viable and would kill the woman carrying it. But what do I know? I'm just a woman with working fallopian tubes. Maybe I'm the crazy one. Add to that the fact that healing often involved charms, rituals, or prayers passed down through generations. These were forms of knowledge outside the official church hierarchy. Midwives become a walking symbol of unauthorized authority. They weren't ordained, they didn't have degrees, they didn't answer to anyone except the pregnant woman in front of them. And that autonomy, that made them dangerous. Look, in a world where childbirth was one of the leading causes of death, midwives were doing life or death work every single day. Some births went well, some didn't. Some infants survived, some didn't. And when things went wrong, people wanted someone to blame. Who better than the woman with all the knowledge? Here's the part that gets messy in the historical record. Midwives were not the majority of those accused of witchcraft. That's a myth created in the 1970s and corrected by later historians like Roper and Hutton. But midwives were disproportionately targeted in specific regions and specific circumstances, particularly in periods when infant mortality was high or when childbirth trauma created the perfect storm of grief, confusion, and fear. Because here's a universal truth of patriarchal societies. When men don't understand something, they make women pay for it. Childbirth was terrifying. Infant mortality was rampant. Medicine was rudimentary. And women who held knowledge, real, tangible, life-saving knowledge, looked like sorceresses to people who believed life and death were in God's hands alone. This is where the slowly rising tide of male scholars, the university-trained physician, started to matter. These men considered themselves the future of medicine, the vanguard of rational healing. They also didn't want competition from women who actually knew how to treat women's health issues. Ehrenreich and English argue that learned physicians and clerical authorities formed an accidental alliance to do something very clever. They reframed women's knowledge as dangerous. Women weren't wise, they were busybodies. Women didn't heal, they meddled. Women didn't know herbs, they consorted with spirits. Women didn't help babies, they risked their souls. And once you establish that a midwife's skill might come from dark forces, the next step is obvious. Put her on trial. The shift didn't happen overnight. It simmered, it brewed, it seeped into sermons and legal codes and gossip. It set the stage for what would become the largest gendered persecution in European history, the witch hunts. But let's be honest, none of this is actually about demons or spells or goats with suspiciously human voices. It's about the oldest story in the world, controlling women's labor, women's knowledge, and women's autonomy. The witch has always represented a kind of woman who moves beyond her socially constructed limits, a woman in motion, a woman with agency, a woman with knowledge and skills. And in 1500, that was the woman who caught babies. The 16th and 17th centuries were master classes in multi-level crisis. Climate patterns shifted violently during the Little Ice Age. Harvests failed, and waves of plague and famine tore through families before they could catch a breath. Religious conflict set entire regions on fire, sometimes literally, and political authority swung between extremes faster than you could say Inquisition. Infant mortality rates soared. Communities were stretched so thin that any misfortune, from a sick child to a spoiled churn of butter, felt like the universe taking something personal. Historians like Lyndal Roper and Ronald Hutton emphasize that witchcraft accusations didn't spike during peaceful, boring decades. They surged precisely when people were stressed, scared, and scrambling for explanations. If your grain fails or your cow dies, you can blame God or the weather. But if your newborn child dies, if the most fragile, precious thing in your world slips away, you need something tangible to hold responsible. And the midwife, the woman who had touched that body, stood closest. Childbirth in early modern Europe wasn't just medical, it was cosmic. Everything about it, the blood, the pain, the risk, suggested that the physical and spiritual worlds were brushing up against each other. Because midwives were present at this threshold, they carried a symbolic weight far beyond their actual role. They guided women into a place that men couldn't understand or follow and couldn't control. In a patriarchal culture, that alone is enough to raise suspicion. Midwives occupied a strange, dangerous paradox. They were the most respected women in the community and the most feared. They knew how to turn a breech baby, ease a contraction, stop hemorrhage, and comfort a mother who was sure she wasn't going to survive this. They could calm a room, assess danger, act decisively, and guide a woman through one of the most emotionally and physically intense experiences of her life. They also saw female nakedness. They handled bodily fluids. They lingered in that liminal space between life and death. They used herbs, rituals, and remedies that men never understood and didn't approve of. They made medical decisions without consulting either priest or physician. In short, they had power, and they used it in a world that punished women for even the appearance of authority. Roper's work is full of cases in which midwives were accused not by men, but by the very women they served. Birth was dangerous, and grief has a long memory. A mother who lost her baby might remember the midwife's offhand remark during labor, her sharp tone during a complication, her earlier argument with a neighbor, or a rumor that her cow had dried up, an omen everyone took seriously. These fragments became puzzle pieces in a story that people were desperate to make sense of. It wasn't malice, it was desperation to make sense of an unthinkable situation. Midwives had the fatal combination of authority, knowledge, and proximity to tragedy. That made them the obvious target when anything went wrong, and because early modern communities were already primed to see women's influence as unstable, unpredictable, even dangerous, accusations escalated quickly. The same woman who helped deliver your child could be blamed for its death. The same woman who saved your life in childbirth could be suspected of causing your infertility. In some regions, midwives were even accused of swapping babies with demons, preserving pain in jars for use in spells, or causing butter to fail. It was the Renaissance version of Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong, and it will be a woman's fault. While ordinary families were locked in these cycles of fear and grief, a different kind of panic was brewing in Europe's universities. These institutions were busy training the first generations of male physicians, men armed with the authority of degrees and the confidence of never having assisted an actual birth. The education was theoretical, abstract, bookish. They believed deeply in their own superiority, and they needed a way to justify why healing should belong to them and not to the people who had been doing it for centuries. The easiest way to build a male monopoly was to delegitimize the people who already knew what they were doing. This is where witchcraft rhetoric found new life. Physicians didn't actually accuse midwives of witchcraft directly. They did something subtler and more effective. They labeled women's medical knowledge as superstition, low class, unscientific, dangerous. They painted their own approach, heavy on the theory of humors in the body, light on practical skill, as the rational and safe alternative. Suddenly, midwives weren't simply women with experience, they were irresponsible, primitive, a threat to good outcomes. The church helped reinforce this shift by declaring certain female healing practices improper or spiritually suspect. Maxwell Stewart documents clerical texts that warned against women who heal by unauthorized means, a phrase that in one swoop condemned everything from herbalism to pain relief in childbirth. Witch beliefs didn't just happen, they were cultivated, encouraged, and weaponized. And once that groundwork was laid, childbirth itself became a battleground. Infant mortality was so common, sometimes affecting 1/3 of all babies, that every birth felt like a roll of loaded dice. Women died in childbirth at horrifying rates too, often from hemorrhage or obstructed labor. In a world without germ theory, without understanding infection, and without consistent access to professional help, everything seemed to hang on luck, and when luck failed, people looked for someone to blame. Early modern courts were full of the same grim logic. If a woman could help bring life into the world, she could also take it out. If she could ease pain, she could cause it. If she could encourage fertility, she could sabotage it. A midwife's skills, interpreted through fear, became proof of hidden power. And hidden power had only one explanation in this world: witchcraft. Roper's trial examples show exactly how this played out. A stillbirth became a sign of malice. A difficult labor became evidence of tampering. A midwife's social conflicts took on supernatural weight. A mother remembered every small moment differently after the fact, reconstructing a pattern she couldn't have seen while she was in agony. Grief filled in the blanks. Gossip confirmed her suspicions, and the community, already terrified by famine, disease, and God's apparent silence, was ready to listen. Once an accusation took hold, the rest followed a catastrophically predictable script. Torture produced elaborate confessions filled with nightmarish imagery, women stealing breast milk, eating fetuses, corrupting wombs. They were not real memories, but fantasies extracted under unbearable pain, echoes of misogynistic fears about women's bodies. Roper notes how these gendered fantasies revealed far more about male anxieties than about women's actual behavior. And through these confessions, the male imagination projected everything it feared about women: their knowledge, their autonomy, their proximity to life's most powerful moments. Midwives weren't terrifying because they were evil, they were terrifying because they knew things that men didn't. It's this fear, the long, simmering distrust of women's authority over reproduction and healing, that paved the way for what came next: the medicalization of childbirth under male authority. The transition from midwives to man-midwives wasn't a natural evolution. It was the result of centuries of conditioning that taught society to see women's expertise as dangerous and men's ignorance as professionalism. Before we go any further, I want to pause the historical reenactment here and make something very clear once more in this episode. Nothing in this episode is an argument against seeking medical care today, especially not during pregnancy or birth. The fact that early modern male physicians were sometimes incompetent, arrogant, or actively harmful does not mean that modern medicine is entirely the enemy. It just means that the road to safe, evidence-based care was built on centuries of sexist bullshit, and we're still cleaning up the debris today. The existence of misogyny in medical history does not mean that childbirth is safer without trained providers. It doesn't make obstetrics optional. It doesn't make unassisted birth empowering. It doesn't turn free birth influencers into revolutionaries. What it does mean is that understanding this history helps us demand better from the systems we have, not abandon them. Because here's the truth. Where early modern midwives relied on generational experience, today's certified midwives, OBGYNs, nurses, and doulas operate with a wealth of medical science behind them. We have antibiotics, oxygen, sterile techniques, ultrasounds, blood transfusions, C-sections, NICUs, and evidence-based protocols that save lives. Modern prenatal care is one of the biggest reasons that maternal and infant mortality plummeted in the 20th century. The problem isn't that medicine is evil. It's that medicine, like every human institution, still carries patriarchal residue that we're having to scrub off. So when I talk about the historical takeover of childbirth and healthcare by male physicians, or the misogyny baked into the professionalization of medicine, I'm not saying reject all doctors or reject Western medicine or trust no medical system. I'm saying that this history explains why some women, especially women of color, queer patients, and disabled patients, still struggle to have their pain believed or their autonomy respected. It doesn't justify unassisted birth. It helps explain why some people are drawn to it in the first place, though. And to be extremely painfully clear, birth is still dangerous. It has always been dangerous. Modern medical support does save lives. In other words, the appropriate modern takeaway from the witch trials isn't ditch your prenatal care. It's demand respectful, safe, evidence-based care and know your history so you can recognize when the system is failing you. Okay, back to the witch hunts. By the late 1600s, witch hunts were beginning to taper off, but the consequences of those centuries of fear were only just kicking in. This is the part of the story where you might hope that women healers finally caught a break. Fewer trials, fewer pyres, and maybe a little less paranoia. But history isn't that generous. Because just as the flames of the witch hunts were dying down, something else was catching fire. The rise of male-dominated medicine. And this wasn't a coincidence. Silvia Federici in Caliban and the Witch argues that the witch hunts weren't an embarrassing superstition, they were a political project. Economically, Europe needed women's labor, bodies, and reproductive capacities to be strictly controlled. The old world, where women had community power, economic independence, and deep experiential knowledge of healing, that world, it had to go. And the witch hunts cleared the ground for something new, a medical system run by men, built on women's subordination. This is the moment where male physicians see an opportunity. For centuries, childbirth had been the domain of women. Learned physicians mostly avoided it, preferring to diagnose imbalanced tumors from a safe distance. But as universities expanded and rational medicine gained prestige, men realized that the biggest, most consistent medical event of human life, birth, was happening entirely outside of their control, and they wanted it back. They didn't just wander in. They arrived with instruments, degrees, and a deeply held belief that their knowledge was superior to the lived experience of midwives. The early man midwives came from elite families and universities carrying forceps, like sacred relics. They talked about science and reason, though much of their training was more astrology than anatomy even then. They arrived with confidence, if not competence, which, again, hasn't really changed much for men in these days, has it? And crucially, they arrived at a moment when women's independent authority had been shattered. Federici points out that the witch hunts had violently destroyed the networks of women who once controlled reproductive knowledge. Midwives, herbalists, and healers had been imprisoned, tortured, executed, or frightened into silence. Their traditions were disrupted, their communities destabilized, and their reputations smeared as both dangerous or demonic. By the late 17th century, even without ongoing trials, women healers lived in a world that had been taught, through fire, law, and fear, to distrust them. So the man midwife stepped into a vacuum he didn't create, but happily benefited from. He described himself as calmer, more rational, more reliable, the same stereotypes that had justified the destruction of women's healing knowledge in the first place. Medicine began to standardize, regulate, and medicalize childbirth, not because these interventions were safer, but because safer wasn't the point. Control was. This is why, even as the witch trials ended, laws restricting midwifery expanded. Women who had spent decades delivering babies now had to be licensed by the same institutions that had always barred them. Exams were written in Latin. Instruction was male-led. Everything about the new system was designed to exclude women. And while midwives struggled through gatekeeping, male physicians were rewriting the rules of childbirth, sometimes disastrously. As the 18th century unfolded, male obstetrics often increased infant and maternal mortality. Forceps were overused. Interventions were chosen for spectacle rather than safety. Hospitals became breeding grounds for infection. Male physicians migrated from autopsies to labor wards and back again without washing their hands, dismissing sanitation as woman's superstition. In some regions, maternal mortality doubled after male midwives replaced traditional midwives. But socially, culturally, legally, the man midwife was still celebrated. And this is where Federici's analysis hits hardest. The shift to male medicine was not about improving outcomes. It was about transforming women's reproductive labor from communal authority to state-managed infrastructure. Childbirth moved from the hands of local women to male professionals who were backed by universities, guilds, medical boards, and the emerging modern state. Even the image of the good medical woman changed. The independent midwife became the dangerous relic of a superstitious past, and the newly created nurse became the ideal, obedient, self-sacrificing, morally pure, and always under the supervision of a male doctor. Women were welcome in medicine only as assistants, never as authorities. This wasn't an accident. It was the logical next step in a long project of undermining women's autonomy. The witch hunts had weakened the power of female healers. The rise of professional medicine finished the job. And that's the devastating insight that Federici brings to this part of the story. Male medical authority didn't replace midwives because it was better. It replaced them because the world had been violently rearranged to make women's knowledge impossible. This isn't the story of scientific progress. This is the story of a hostile takeover. So here we are at the end of the episode. And if you're a man, you might be thinking, wow, we've really evolved since the 17th century. If you're a woman, you know that's a bunch of bullshit. Federici's later work, Witches, Witch Hunting, and Women, opens with a blunt truth. Societies are still policing women's bodies, labor, sexuality, and autonomy using the same logic that drove the witch hunts. The targets may look different, but the underlying fears haven't changed at all. In early modern Europe, the witch was a woman who stood outside the reproductive and economic roles that patriarchy had assigned her. She might have been unmarried, childless, sexually independent, or simply inconvenient. She was the woman with knowledge men didn't control, the woman who survived without male protection, the woman who lived too loudly or too freely. She was dangerous not because of magic, but because of autonomy. Today, we don't accuse women of flying to Sabbath or copulating with the devil. We accuse them of being irresponsible, unfit, selfish, unnatural, immoral, emotional. But the pattern is the same. A woman who chooses not to marry? Suspicious. A woman who chooses not to have children? Selfish. A woman who demands reproductive freedom? A threat. A woman who expects her pain to be treated seriously? Overdramatic. A woman who wants to control her own body? Political enemy number one. Any woman who has ever tried to be diagnosed for endometriosis, tried to schedule a hysterectomy or a tubal ligation, or begged a doctor to actually diagnose her rather than just tell her to go home and lose some weight, knows this all too well. Federici makes it clear that modern witch hunts often occur in places experiencing rapid economic upheaval, land privatization, resource extraction, or shifts in labor patterns. In India, sub-Saharan Africa, and Papua New Guinea, women who are widowed, childless, or economically independent are still beaten, exiled, and murdered after being labeled witches. The justification shifts, but the function remains the same, policing women's labor and property in moments of social instability. And in the West, the methods are different, but chillingly recognizable. We criminalize miscarriage. We surveil pregnancy. We legislate uterus after uterus. We force women to carry non-viable pregnancies to term. We deny their medical experiences. We treat their autonomy as politically dangerous. The witch hunts were not just about belief. They were about discipline. Discipline of women's bodies, minds, and labor. That logic still runs under our laws, our healthcare system, our workplaces, and our culture, like an underground current we pretend not to notice. And that brings us to the final uncomfortable truth of this episode. Modern medicine is still built on the same structures that replaced midwives with male authority. We see it every time a doctor dismisses a woman's symptoms. Every time Black women face higher maternal mortality rates because their pain is ignored. Every time we see a new graduating class of doctors who inexplicably believe that Black people have thicker skin and higher pain tolerances. Every time a woman is denied reproductive care because someone in power believes her body belongs to the state. Every time the law treats pregnancy as a moral test rather than a medical condition. Every time women's knowledge, instinct, pain, expertise, tradition is treated as inferior to institutional authority. Federici calls the witch the figure of female autonomy that had to be destroyed, and she argues that female autonomy is still being destroyed, slowly, bureaucratically, legally, to keep a deeply unequal system running. The witch is a threat because she is able to choose, because she knows, because she doesn't apologize, and she doesn't obey. This is why the witch has become a feminist icon, not because of broomsticks or crystals, but because she represents everything society still punishes women for being, independent, unruly, wise, and unwilling to be controlled. So while we don't burn witches anymore, we make their lives smaller, we limit their choices, we legislate their bodies, we doubt their voices, we erase their histories, but the witch survives. The witch was never the problem. Thank you for tuning in to Bitchy History. As we step away from the bonfires of the witch hunts, it's worth noticing what happens next. Once societies finish terrorizing women who know too much, they turn their energy towards stopping girls from ever becoming those women in the first place. The witch was the cautionary tale. Girlhood became the prevention strategy. In the next episode, we're going to follow that thread forward into the 20th century, where we'll look at the absolute terror that is engendered by girls being taught that they are full human beings, using the Girl Scouts as our case study in how America absolutely loses its fucking mind when 12-year-olds start learning leadership, citizenship, and global awareness, at least when they're girls. We'll look at why a movement built on campfires, service projects, and cookie sales has spent over a century being treated as a political threat, and what that reveals about a culture that still sees empowered girls as more dangerous than the systems that contain them. That's it for this episode of Bitchy History. If you enjoyed the show, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, review, and share it with someone who loves history as much as we do. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the world around you.
History. What a bitch, right?